Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Society for Clinical Research Sites and SCRS Talks. I'm Jimmy Bechtel, the Vice President of Site Engagement with the Society. And I'm joined today by David Vulcano, who serves as SCRS's Honorary President, and he is also in leadership position at HCA Healthcare. David often serves, for those of you that are unfamiliar, which I'm sure the list is short, as one of our go-to individuals for regulatory updates and some of the things that come out of the FDA. David has a knack and a true talent for helping us understand and interpret these things. And I know many of you rely on David's expertise through the online community and through some of the sessions at the Site Solutions Summit to provide insight into finance and the changing regulatory landscape. And that's exactly what we're here to do today. We want to talk a little bit and share David's knowledge and what we're able to ascertain from the recent ICH GCP R6E3 revisions. I know there's been a lot of conversation around this, a lot of discussion, and everyone seems to be providing updates here, but we just want to share a little bit of information on how this looks to, or maybe will not be, affecting and impacting the sites in maybe some of the ways that we might interpret. There's a lot of worry and a lot of hype around this, but as we'll find today, there's not much to be worried about. I think as long as we're aware and we know of the changes, right, David, I think we're going to be in good shape.
Yeah, I agree, Jimmy. I think despite all the hype from the vendors that want to sell a lot of education on it, we can take a step and calm down a little bit. The direction of this end was not as unanticipated. I mean, the things that the new revisions to the GCPs are directionally where we're going in, a lot of the stuff we were doing anyway. Now it codifies it in GCPs, yes, and there will be anxiety. There will be some differing interpretations and things like that will cause some stress and anxiety. Don't get us wrong. It's not a panacea. I don't like the way that it's written. A lot of it is very goal oriented instead of prescriptive. And a lot of it is a little nebulous as to who's responsible for what. And, compliance wonks out there always like to say, this is responsible for this person. This is responsible for this activity, as opposed to kind of the more we're all in this together. But overall, it's directionally in the same direction the industry's been going for a period of time. And there should be very little surprises in anybody who actually reads it.
So thanks, David. Can you kind of dive into that a little bit and share, as you've gone through this, what are some of the more significant changes, I guess, if we want to hone in on some of those introduced in the E3 revisions and how those might differ from previous guidelines in terms of an impact, of course, particularly to our site audience?
Yeah, a lot of it is on the back end of sponsors on how to write protocols and risk-based monitoring and things along those lines, things that we have seen before and carrying forward. But for the site community, while a lot of this is heavily behind the scenes on sponsors, there's a lot of things that do trickle down to the sites. So first, you get really jazzed when you see some of the principles. Like there's a new principle in there that says the sponsor should not place unnecessary burden on participants and investigators. And the sponsor should ensure that sufficient resources are available to appropriately conduct the study. And while we may sit there and applaud this and cite this back to sponsors and their CRO service providers, this is always a struggle that we face with every day. So it's great to have these lofty type principles, but when it gets down to brass tactics, we're still going to, in my expectation, fight to struggle to reduce unnecessary burden on the sites and fight to get sufficient resources to conduct the studies. So the principles are more outlined there, and maybe we can use that more as defense in advocating for ourselves as sites in getting those. But there's a few key areas that we see. And I don't know, Jimmy, if you want to just kind of shut up one by one. I mean, the three biggest areas I would see that's going to trickle down mostly to the sites is the first, a little bit about the decentralization of trials and involving non-traditional site partners or service providers into the investigator and site duties, or the decentralization, so to speak. The second is a lot about record retention, changes in that areas. And the third is about a lot of the electronics that are coming out, the so-called e-thingies or digital health technologies, and kind of part and parcel to all of these as an underlying thread is what I would consider a fourth area that sites should be aware of. And that's the emerging importance of implementing cybersecurity stuff. So decentralized, record retention, digital technologies, and cyber. So do you have a preference on where we go first?
I mean, yeah, whatever you want, David, dive in there. I think a lot of them, they all share equal weight, I'm sure, for different sites. So yeah, wherever you want to dive in. Yeah.
Let's kind of go in order with it. Then let's talk about the decentralized trials. So obviously, the years since they've been having more and more decentralized trials, there's always been this angst among clinical investigator sites and investigators themselves on oversight of these new team players or new members of our extended team. And key differentiation was a lot of the anxiety oversight when it comes to a new member that is selected or chosen by the sponsor or the CRO in the study. Well, the GCPs kind of make this a little bit more clear in this. It may not be to our liking on it, but it is at least more clear in that, 2.3.1 talks about that if the sponsor is selecting a service provider that's going to be acting on behalf of the investigator. So they're selecting a service provider that's doing something that would traditionally be done by the research site, like participant visits or things along those lines. It's clear in 2.3.1 that says the investigator retains the final decision on whether the service provider is intended to support the investigator. And it's based on information provided by the sponsor. It's like, hey, sponsor, you got to tell me about this vendor or the service provider that you are hiring. You got to tell me all this stuff. I mean, I make the final determination whether I'm going to use them or not. So, great in theory, very supportive of site in theories. Of course, it doesn't alleviate the things that many sites have been faced with in the past already of thou shalt use that vendor or you will not be allowed to do the study. But nevertheless, it does at least give something for the investigator to stand on and say, you know what, I do have some control on this. I may not be able to do the study, but if I'm doing the study, I can control a little bit about what this service provider is doing. So that's one key within that. It talks about, specifically calls out one section, 2.10.3 on investigational product management. So that's when, if the sponsor is taking on that, like direct to shipping participants, that the investigator is still responsible for that aspects of it. And that was very similar, like in the FDA guidance on decentralized trials. It then goes on to a little bit about these service providers on their quality assurance and their quality management process. The section 3.6.10 references that their quality assurance, some of these service providers may not be clinical trial specific people. They may have other duties that they're doing or other businesses that they're in. They're called to help with trials. And that their quality management process may not be designed specifically for GCP compliance, but it is fit for purpose in the context of the trial. And the term fit for purpose is something we see a lot in the new GCPs. We'll be hearing that term a lot. And then similar to that, they talk about the use of healthcare practitioners. And we have the same problem in the GCPs as we did in the FDA draft guidance on whether or not these people are delegated authority or are they sub-investigators or not. And at least in the new GCPs, section 2.3.3 talks about in situations where the activities are performed as part of clinical practice, they don't need to be on any type of delegation documentation. But they don't define what clinical practice is. So it gets into that nebulous training that was so problematic with the FDA guidance on this as to, if the protocol says you have to take the blood pressure from the right arm and your normal practice is you give them a choice, is that a violation? Or, if you normally give the patient a choice between getting the EKG first before the blood draw, but the protocol requires it. So it still gets into that little nebulous stuff there. And then the other part is the verifying of identities. And this is new, where it talks about the investigator's obligation. And this is in 2.8.1e, that's when they are doing informed consent, whether in person or remotely, that's kind of a new obligation on the investigator to assure themselves of the identity of the participants or the legally authorized representative in accordance with whatever regulatory standards you might have on verifying identity. And that could vary from country to country, even state to state. So some of this decentralization is having some of those challenges.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, David, because these are things that we've been talking about and have kind of had big question marks over the top of them for the last few years when it comes to decentralization and the oversight and really everything that you talked about, this idea, right, kind of piggybacking on the DHT guidance. digital health technologies guidance around that concept of what is clinical practice does not need to be delegated. It can just be conducted. So it's obvious that the lines are still a little blurry here. It kind of just says this is what it is, but it obviously is going to be left up to interpretation by the sponsor and the site. But at least to me, it's a step in the right direction because it does, like you said previously, kind of ratify some of the things that we've been doing and some of the assumptions that we've been making, hopefully providing an additional little layer of clarity for investigators around their power and their ability to make those decisions and what is and what isn't. So I guess if we were to tell sites anything about this and kind of add on to this, David, in this space here, it's form SOPs and opinions or positions on these interpretations and implement them consistently across your organization, but also make sure that you're on the same page going into a trial with your sponsor or CRO based on those SOPs, which should, of course, always be based in ICH GCP. And that will probably set you up for success as a site as it pertains to these DCTs.
Yeah. So definitely focus on those sections and recognize your obligation as a site and an investigator. If you're in the trial, it shows that you do have a little bit of control on this, but you have to be in the trial. And if the stance of the sponsors or CROs are, many sites use the word that they're bullied into using this particular service. So you can't use this if you want to be in the trial. You have to use this. Well, the new GCPs doesn't make that concept go away. But what it does do, in theory, empower the investigator once they're in the trial, that they do have a little bit more autonomy with it.
That's great. Well, do you want to jump to the next one then, David?
Yeah, sure. Record retention. And as you know, Jimmy,
an area of passion for you.
Yeah, it has been. And as a society, we've been gathering data on this because this is something that is just getting more and more problematic for sites because, especially with the shift from paper to electronic records, we're not record archivists. We're not in this business. And it's vastly more complicated than throwing a whole bunch of paper in a box and shipping it to a third-party vendor and essentially forgetting about it. But yeah, so a little bit of whirligigs in the record retention. I mean, first and foremost, the original R2 of GCPs was talking about we'll talk about the duration of the record retention first. And then we'll talk about the new challenges in this new environment, which the GCPs are calling out. So the duration was one thing. I mean, the R2 was talking about the floating 2-year thing of 2 years after approval or withdrawal, et cetera, among any of GCP abiding countries. Well, they did away with that. And they're basically now saying that you will keep the records per your local applicable regulatory requirements. So if you're in US, you keep for FDA. If you're in Canada, you keep for Health Canada. If you're in EU, you keep per EMA regulations. That is the core. And it's not trying to say that you have to keep for, based off of every regulation. If EU is 25 years, well, that no longer kind of applies to me as the site because it's talking about your applicable regulatory requirements. So I'm celebrating reading that, but then unfortunately, they kept the second caveat, which basically says, and this is in 2.12.12, required record retention in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements, or until the sponsor informs the investigator that these records are no longer needed, whichever is the longest. And that's been creating so much of the anxiety with the sites. I mean, as you know, based on our surveys, slightly over 2/3 of the sites do not want to be in the record archiving business. Only 1/3 are wanting to explore this as a value add to the customers. But 2/3 don't want to be in this. We'll keep per regulatory obligations, but we don't want to get longer, and it's getting more complicated. So that new sentence there is interesting because it basically puts it in the market forces. So the other sections of the new GCPs require an agreement. 3.6.3 says the sponsor must have an agreement in the agreement about the record retention period per regulatory requirements or longer if informed by the sponsor. We're still faced with the core problem, but it does at least give the sites a little bit more grounding, I would say, in going back to sponsors and saying, look, we're keeping per our regulatory requirements for our local institution. So you can't really impose other regulatory requirements. But if we're going to enter into the business of record archiving, address it now in the contract. If we're not going to do it, let's not leave it open-ended. But if we are going to do it, then let's understand what we have to do. So let's go to that second part. For the sites that want to be in the record archiving business, very carefully read these sections in the GCPs, because it talks a lot about the obligations of the site, especially, and we'll talk a little bit about the cybersecurity stuff too. But read out and call out what you have to understand. So I'll mention some of this. So the sites are supposed to notify. So the essential records collection and this is in 4.2.7. The trial data and relevant metadata should be archived in a way that allows for retrieval and readability and should be protected from unauthorized access and alterations throughout the retention period. And when we talk about cybersecurity, you're going to learn a little bit more about what that entails. So it's going to be still some negotiations between the sites and the sponsors on this. I mean, the good news is that we don't have a longer of the global record retention requirements, but nevertheless, this is part of it. So like the sponsor, in addition to getting this into an agreement and making sure it's addressed in agreement, which it almost already is, they added a new sponsor requirement that the sponsors monitors have to confirm the arrangement for the retention of the essential records during the site closeout activity. So that's something, if it hasn't been done, that we can expect the sites that they will do. And that's a great time to bring it up to the sponsors and say, we're not capable of doing this. Ideally, it's in the beginning, but at the closeout visit, it could be saying, we're not capable of doing this. We don't have the hardware degradation plans in place. We don't have the software obsolescence management and things along those lines. A little bit of positive here doesn't fully alleviate the challenge, but nevertheless, I think this is a great opportunity with these new GCPs to really enhance our discussions with sponsors and CROs. Applaud the ones that are taking this monkey off of the site's burden when they want the records for their business needs after the site's regulatory obligations are done. We're seeing more and more of those sponsors take on those obligations. But for the ones who aren't and believe that the sites should be the ones to be their record archivists after the site's regulatory obligations are over, I think this is going to be a great resource to have those discussions and ground these discussions into reality.
That's exactly right, David. And that's the important takeaway that I get from this is, as a site, again, similar to what we talked about with the DCT related guidances there and technology use on clinical trials is, as a site, know what your regulations are, know what your local regulatory obligation is, and design your SOPs around that. And at trial startup, make sure that the sponsors and CROs are aware of that. And if there's any pushback on that, or they're requiring anything outside of that, then it's up to the site to decide whether or not they want to, facilitate that and enable that additional requirement. However, that should also be compensated appropriately at the site level if it's going to be something above and beyond regulatory requirements. One can make the argument that all of that needs to be paid for, which I would be in support of, but at minimum, the site can say, this is our SOP. It's based on what the GCP guidance says, current GCP guidance says, this is what our regulatory obligation is for our X state in X country. And therefore, this is what we'll be doing. And if you have anything outside of that, it's up for interpretation and negotiation at the site level.
And this revision kind of, probably not intentionally, but nevertheless appropriately puts that in the realm of business terms so that it's no longer, GCP requires it for all these regions and EU is this and that, or Japan is this and that. It's, local regulatory requirements, which you should know. And then after that, put it in the business terms within it. So I don't think it was intentionally done that way, but it does at least put it back into the business terms between the site.
That's perfect. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, David, do you want to jump to the cybersecurity aspect of it then?
Yeah. So, a lot of the electronic stuff we've been used to moving over to, it's the one thing in deploying the technology. I mean, before we jump to that cyber, we want to talk about deploying the technology and the new revisions of the GCPs it's appreciated that they do call out a little differentiating obligations between whether that technology is deployed by the investigator or institution or whether that technology is deployed by the sponsor. And essentially calling out that he or she who deploys the technology is the one responsible for making that technology meet all the new standards of data and data integrity that the new R3 of the GCPs has put forth. I mean, those of you that know this, there's a whole new section about data integrity in this R3. And, sites that are deploying their own technology need to understand that. So that could be one of the bigger impacts, at least initially on the sites, to make sure that they have determined that the technology that they deploy is fit for purpose, based off of these new GCP standards, which are all in essentially section 4 of the new GCPs. It talks about the provided to trial participants by the investigator. That's the participants, whether it's deployed by the sponsor or the investigator institution, that the participants, that it's traceable and that they're provided with appropriate training and things along those lines. So fit for purpose is used multiple times in this, whether it's sponsor deployed tech, investigator deployed tech used by the participants, or just general supportive technology, not applied specifically for a trial, but something that is used in general, like say electronic medical records is what they call out, that it is assessed for fitness of purpose. And the new GCPs talks about in section 316.1, subpart 6, talks about the tech that's used or deployed by the investigator, that the sponsor has some obligation to assess whether such systems are fit for purpose. So that's kind of a new exchange that we'll have to see how sponsors get with this. Now, jump into one last thing on that. Section 437A talks about, if there are technology, it says there should be mechanisms such as help desk support in place to document, evaluate, and manage the issues when computerized systems are used, and periodic review of these issues. So if sponsors are deploying the tech, they're responsible for this section 4, and they're responsible for the help desk support. If the sites are deploying a tech, same principles apply. Now, the cyber issue is key, and we're pleased to say that we had authored and published out a site manager's non-technical guide to cybersecurity on a budget for some of the smaller sites out there that are not part of a large system with a lot of cybersecurity resources. But nevertheless, when you're thinking about deploying technology or retaining records during or even after your regulatory support, read this. It's going to be scary for people when you look at this about mitigating security breaches, user authentication, password management, antivirus software, security patching, system monitoring, penetration testing, backup of the data, disaster recovery, all of these things that, your average site may not be savvy enough. So, cybersecurity is not an IT issue. It's everybody's issue, of which IT is one component. I think sites over the next couple of years are going to be very awakened as to how serious everything is on cybersecurity.
Well, that's exactly right, David. And I appreciate you mentioning the guide that we had provided to, which I hope a lot of sites that are concerned about this, or even if you don't think you're concerned about it, should be concerned and really take this into attention and do something about it. And for the sake of time, David, I'd like to kind of close us out with a sharing of what sites should do and then how sponsors and CROs can support sites in implementing these revisions so that we continue to be collaborative and we continue to be seamless. And for me, my big takeaway from the conversation was as sites take some of these things as well as some of the other things that we've mentioned and that others are mentioning, and make sure that you have the appropriate SOPs and procedures and policies in place that support GCP and support your site enabling that GCP, and stick to those and have that open line of communication with the sponsors and CROs at study inception so that we know when these things come to a head that we're not scrambling to put them in place or not trying to create something on the fly and build these SOPs in. And then sponsors and CROs, it's reciprocal, right? We have to be able to accept these things and say, okay, yeah, that's great. That is in conformity with GCP. And we've also done our work to not overextend or overburden the site, and we're accepting the interpretations of GCP and other regulatory necessities, but not putting anything extra on top of it, I think is the really big thing, right? Record retention is a great example of something where, we've met our regulatory requirements. Maybe we've met a few extra requirements that the sponsor has as applicable and as paid for, but the regulatory say 2 years. Why does it need to be 15 years for that, right? For that particular country? That's because the sponsor wants it that way. So let's get away from those practices of overextending and overburdening the sites because a sponsor or a CRO wants something a particular way that is way beyond the needs of regulatory and GCP. Those would be my two.
It would be consistent with the new principles. Section 2.7.4, the sponsor should not place unnecessary burden on participants and investigators. And section 3.2, the sponsor should ensure that sufficient resources are available to appropriately conduct a study. And I'm going to call out two last things, Jimmy, before we part. One is on training. Obviously, there's all sorts of third-party vendors going out there for training now that are either charging or free. I know we have our initiative on trying to right-size site training under the banner Cut 25 and 25. But I think this is a perfect opportunity for collaborations with our sponsors and CROs on this so that we right size this out the gate. I mean, everybody is going to want to be, are the sites updated on training? And clearly we need to send the message out that I don't want to have to take every sponsor and every CRO's training that's repetitive over and over again, just so I check the box and take their training. So I think this is a great opportunity with the collaborations that we're doing on site training and right-sizing site training to make sure that the sponsors and CROs are not just coming out with check the box or duplicative training, that if a site is trained on the new GCPs, they don't have to take one for every sponsor or CRO out there. So I hope that we can get there. And the second thing I'll say is that there already is, and there's going to be a lot of myths about GCPs. We're starting to see chatter on a lot of site boards about, the new GCP says this or that. And my encouragement to the sites is, if you've read these and you understand them, and you are faced with a sponsor or CRO or somebody saying, well, the new GCPs say this, just ask them to cite it. So, gosh, well, that's great. I didn't catch that. Can you cite the section that says this, or show me the section? And don't just accept, it's in the new GCPs. We had chatter about, brackets are not allowed in source documents. You can't use brackets. That's GCP. It's like, well, we've searched R2, we've searched R3, and nowhere does it even use the word bracket or parentheses for that matter. So I think that in this time of stabilization, that's if you have something and it's cited as required by the new GCPs and you're just not familiar with it, you definitely ask for the citation. And if they can't provide that citation, then handle it in an appropriate and respectful manner. Certainly calling out the citation of 2.7.4, the sponsor should not place unnecessary.
Excellent, David. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a really great place for us to end our conversation here. Thank you, David, as always, for your insights. Tremendously valuable. And I hope, I know that our site audience, as well as I hope our sponsor and CRO audience, have been able to take some things away from this, areas to investigate further and develop their own practices and policies / procedures on and go forward. So again, thank you for your time today. And for those listening, definitely check out myscrs.org for some of the resources that David had mentioned on the call today, as well as the regular mainstay topics surrounding some of these areas like cybersecurity and digital health technology implementation on clinical trials throughout our various publications. And of course, at our Site Solutions Summit, where these topics are regularly discussed. So thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. And until next time.
Thank you.